Okay.
All right, folks. So, Yuliya, if you would like to begin, I mean, how long do you think you will need? How long will you? Oh.
Well, we had a chat about this with Chris, and we agreed kind of within the remits of 10 minutes, because like it's best to give a short overview and then have a discussion, because like it's always better to have it more of a dialogue than
Okay, absolutely.
than a prayer. So shall I start?
Okay, now you are not coming in, Chris. You're just here.
Oh, he's prepared. He's prepared. Let him.
Do you want to come in as well, Chris, after Yuliya?
Yes.
Okay.
He has to work for that CIA money somehow.
Yeah.
I thought it was the speaker alongside Yuliya. But then I read an invitation that said it was a backup.
All right. Okay. We'll do it.
A bit of a pessimistic indication.
We'll do it as we'll give you a slot. Yuliya's only going to talk for 10 minutes or so. Then you can come in and talk for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up. Is that all right?
That's fine.
Yeah, that sounds good. I've never had a backup act before, but I suppose it's the first time I'm in the war of this proportion. So I'm going to kind of kick off so that I do not waste any more time. So for those of you who are meeting me for the first time, my name is Yuliya Yurchenko. I'm Iranian. I'm from Ukraine. I'm from Vinnytsia, where I am right now. I grew up here. Then I went to uni in Kiev, and from there I went to the UK for what was going to be a one-year trip, and it's I'm still based there. It will be 18 years in September. And I'm a scholar of Ukraine and an activist, and that's how I'm associated with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, and that's, I think, partly like one of the reasons why I'm in this room as well, like, you know, the path that kind of took me here. So I don't want to focus too much on what I suppose you already know from the overwhelming news coverage, despite some UK and Oscar's news trying to take over the kind of more gruesome realities of our world. But I'll just say a couple of things of the current situation, and then also of what needs to be done, because I think those elements are kind of a bit more important right now. The war of Russia against Ukraine is coming off the back of centuries of conflict, of multi-level conflict. It's a colonial and imperialist conflict and a war in its long-term essence, it caught many by surprise, and I'm not sure why it caught anybody by surprise, because this war, first of all, is already 8 years old. And a lot of tactics that we have seen in 2014, discursive legitimizing tactics, as well as military tactics, as well as like pretend negotiation tactics, we have seen them already. And we have seen the same tactics with sleepers and infiltration of people within Ukraine. We have seen all sorts of kind of backdoor geopolitical maneuvering of Western politicians. It's all already been done, and then done. And it was clear that also, when we look at the current dynamic of what some refer to as negotiations, we realize that it's not negotiations at all. Like it's simply either stalling techniques or yet again kind of manipulation techniques. Like every other time Russians come to the table, they either come with no proposals whatsoever besides full capitulation, or they come with a list of ever-changing requests. So it's kind of not to be ableist here or dismissive or offensive, but it is schizophrenic, right? Like it doesn't make sense. I just can't think of a better terms. We're not negotiating with a set of clear demands. And if we look at Kremlin rhetoric, if we look at those kind of famous speeches of Putin, it was all in there. So in the same letter, he would be assessing that Russia acknowledges Ukraine's right to have its own politics and policies and be its own state. And then next they're saying, well, Ukraine is a made up country with a made up language. And it's all in the same text on A4. So like it's all been there in the open. There is no secret and no pretense in how Russia sees Ukraine. And I think what we are now seeing, which is a positive thing, I suppose, is that a lot of scholars of Russia and Ukraine and post-Soviet space who have had a more critical eye of what Russia has become since USSR fell apart, they are finally getting a bit of a hearing, because we have had a lot of those of us with a slightly more critical eye to what has happened after the USSR fell apart have been a bit frustrated with some on the Western Anglophone and otherwise left who have failed to see that USSR ceased to exist. That what is Russia is not an ideological counterweight to the United States. And for their anti-Americanism, they failed to see that what is developing in Russia is a corrupt, dysfunctional, antisocial and anti-socialist state that is a kleptocracy run by ex-KGB agents. And so the kind of similar constellations existed in Ukraine when Ukraine became independent, where nomenklaturщiks and some security officials kind of had their hands deep in the pockets of the state, but then through the process of privatization and emergence of oligarchy, the balance of power between security forces and this kind of criminals turned oligarchs has shifted a bit. But in Russia, that didn't happen. Like, the security people remained in charge, and then oligarchs are sort of are servicing them in a sense. But then we can talk about the essence of Russia later. So what we're seeing now is there's some kind of the last hiccups of some sort of of this kind of offended Russians as oppressed Russians and offended Nazis, some sort of project. I'm using kind of Nazi here almost metaphorically, because there are fascist elements in what's happening right now in Russia. But I understand that we need to be careful with what kind of labels we attach to who. But a lot of what is happening in the mainstream Russian politics right now, and the way that they're framing themselves in this kind of this rebuilding of this kind of build new Russian empire narrative is some sort of some analysts refer to it as some sort of inversion of what was happening in Germany under Hitler. And I'm not saying that it's the same thing. It's just kind of some things are kind of, well, I'm just appealing to this in this specific instance, that when, for example, the German project meant that Germans were superior, their sort of superiority complex and project was built on declaring that they're superior than everybody else and everybody should be eliminated. Russia is building this project around how all of these kind of post-Soviet states and ex-Russian empire, we're all the same, we're all brethren. While at the same time, it's very clear that they're in charge and they're superior. So there is this kind of forceful assimilation into Russia that they're using as a strategy of demanding control over past Russian imperial territories. But let's come back to today, and we can discuss this kind of project of Putin later, because there are a lot of contradictions in it, and it's very important to not oversimplify what is going on in there internally and in terms of their foreign policy. It is what we've also seen in Ukraine's attempt for self-determination is not only an inability or not least for external frustrations of internal dynamics, but also inability of building some sort of consolidated kind of hegemonic project of domestic elites, if you like, of domestic ruling class, and their kind of attempts to flirt with different foreign partners have created fertile soil on which certain divisions within the country were also possible, to which we can speak to later. But Ukraine's self-determination project, because of its economic, not least, weakness when USSR fell apart, has made it vulnerable to various pulls and pressures from outside and also from within. And what we see by now is some of the some of the cultural and linguistic and divisions, well, they were not divisions, they were differences, were turned into divisions and were turned into animosities and are now being used to split the country artificially into some sort of dilapidating parts. And that is something that can also, that already is making, that has created problems in 2013 and 14, not least because of certain legitimizing narratives that different competing blocs had over Ukraine, internal and external. But right now, what we see is that, like, you know, for Ukraine to have any sort of consolidated national reconstruction project, those divisions that have been exacerbated by these pulls and pushes to various directions, they will have to be addressed in a meaningful sense. And in a way, this horrendous aggression from Russia is playing its part in consolidating Ukraine into a multicultural, multi-ethnic political nation. How it will come out of this, we will see. A lot will depend on whether Ukraine will win this war, and that will also partly depend on how much support it will get from its Western partners. Ukraine seriously needs a lot of arms because it is heavily outweighed in terms of military capacity compared to Russia. Ukrainians are winning on the level of spirit and fighting, like we have seen. You know, the Western so-called partners have sold off Ukraine long time ago. Like we've seen, like Chris, we had this conversation in a different meeting. There was this interview 2 days ago with Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, who by now openly said that when he came to a finance minister of Germany to ask for support on the first day of attacks on the 24th of February, the response that he got was that, well, you know, let's face it, it will all be over in a few hours. There is no point selling you any help, and then we'll have to get used to the new order of things. And that was not just the German sentiment. It was a general sentiment that we see from how a lot of so-called Western partners and guarantors of Ukrainian security were responding, how slow they were on supplying such important help to Ukraine, who were largely left to fend for themselves. And only thanks to this undying spirit of Ukrainian military and the pulling together of Ukrainian people, the volunteer movement, the territorial battalions, there was the West has seen that they have to respond. They wouldn't have had otherwise. I don't think they would have had. That is absolutely heartbreaking and nerve-wrenching. Ukraine is an annex to this kind of neo-imperialistic competition. And that has become very clear. And some of the Eastern Central European states have also realized in this conflict, those who have joined NATO hoping that they will get protection with neo-imperialistic ambitions of Russia, they realize that actually likely they will not be protected either, so should they be attacked. Because they are being used as a market for expensive weapons and annexes to the North Atlantic military treaty. And in that sense, there is a hope that there will be a reorganization of the international security order so that Central and Eastern European states will realize that NATO will not protect them, that a lot of smaller states, they have to build an alternative alliance of defense against this metropolitan, the metropoles of old empires, who are only as powerful as the amount of satellites that they have. And there needs to also be, if Ukraine is to be helped, so first of all, there needs to be military aid, fast and a lot of it, humanitarian support, there needs to be, and there was a lot of popular support across European states and beyond. And we've received a lot of messages of solidarity from our Syrian comrades, from our comrades in Latin American and in African countries who have seen, who have themselves experienced powerless, not so much powerlessness, but rather they've experienced exactly how far, rather how not far enough solidarity of the old colonial centers goes, because the prayers and the messages of support are not going to stop the troops of bombs falling. They never had and they never will. And this is another, on a lot across different left organizations right now, there is it's a bit of a contentious point. So some are supporting military aid to Ukraine, some are not supporting military aid to Ukraine. And the thing is, if we were having this conversation in 2012 or even 7, maybe we could behave in that conversation. But right now, 8 years into this war, and right now when so many Ukrainian cities are annihilated, so many people are murdered, so many, mainly women, are raped, children are broken, and so many millions are displaced. I mean, are we really debating, should we be using sanctions or sending weapons? Like, is that even a question? Like, seriously? You know, I'm also for peace and against weapons and violence, but the cities of my country are blasted right now as we speak. People are being murdered, tortured, kidnapped, and raped right now. And Ukraine needs military aid. Then Ukraine needs what, like, you know, one of the campaigns I'm involved with and I coordinated with the left organization in Ukraine called Socialny Ruch, or Social Movement, is the campaign for cancellation of Ukraine's debt, because no country in the state of war that could have been prevented should there haven't been this, you know, inter-imperialistic competition. No country should be prioritizing debt repayment when its military needs support and its citizens need humanitarian help. Next, there needs to be large-scale macroeconomic assistance without conditions attached, with marketization as priority being removed altogether. Conditions of engagement with the EU under the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement should be reviewed so that Ukraine can become a developmental state. It needs to be that if it is to be rebuilt, should, and I hope soon, this war to be over. There need to be reparations from private corporations as well as from the states. And here I'm talking, like, you know, so when I talk about large-scale macroeconomic assistance from countries other than Russia, I essentially talk of reparations for Western inaction, because they could have prevented this war and they haven't. To me, this is reparations for the country that has been basically thrown to the dogs. And it could have been prevented. NATO should have been disbanded in '91, if not sooner. And it wasn't. And it's not a justification for what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but it really didn't help the situation, let's face it. You know, we should be able to criticize both. You know, and I'm not trying to kind of to pin blame on any concrete actor here, but we know that this kind of baiting of each other between Russia and NATO has been happening for a long time. And we need to be, like, you know, without having some sort of hard-nosed Stalinist position, we should be able to criticize what NATO is doing while saying that it is Russia who's bombing Ukraine. And it is Ukraine who now needs weapons, because it has become this kind of yet another proxy in this stupid confrontation, right? So that needs to happen. And what else? Yes, and a large-scale sort of reconstruction plan, something similar, like some politicians already voiced it, something along the lines of what Marshall Plan looked like, right? But much more large scale and much more serious. And yet another, and the last thing, that's what I wanted to say, because, like, you know, there is this kind of talk about freezing of the assets, and, like, you know, and Ukrainian government already said that they want to, they're planning to repossess all the Russian oligarchic enterprises in Ukraine and kind of seize their assets and, you know, and use them to rebuild the country. Well, that isn't enough, because it's not just the Russian oligarchs who are exploiting Ukraine, and not only Ukraine. It needs to be all oligarchic enterprises. So this is something that I want to see for Ukraine, that oligarchic enterprises are passed into collective ownership and management of their workers. Because Ukrainian oligarchs have also created fertile soil on which confrontation was made possible. They have helped destabilize the country through getting money from IMF, flirting with the EU, at the same time wanting cheap gas from Russia, and trying to kind of play completely incompatible geopolitical games, right? There is blame on them as well. So if EU is serious about de-oligarchization of Ukraine, they need to allow Ukraine to crack down on its oligarchs meaningfully, not through setting up some sort of commission and saying, "Ooh, pay a bit more tax." No, those financial industrial groups were built through theft, and they need to be passed back into the hands of people who built them, and work towards the benefit of the country on the bones of which, by now, literally, those enterprises are built. So I've spoken for like 6 extra minutes on what I was allowed. But that's my kind of what is to be done essay for you, for Ukraine. And I'm happy to discuss any more elements of it. Some of it maybe wasn't as eloquent as I wish it were. There is a lot of emotion involved in all of this, but I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you have. And I look forward to hearing what Chris has to say, because he always has really great insights on Ukraine.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Yuliya. Before we bring Chris in, has anybody got any immediate questions? Or okay, then we'll bring Chris in, and then we'll have a general discussion when Chris has had his say.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Yuliya. I just wanted to do a quick push for comrades to recognise Yuliya's fantastic book, the Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, which gives a fantastic analysis and a breakdown of the composition of the elites in Ukraine, and which led in the run up to when the war actually began. And I think it's important that we recognise that this war didn't begin on the 24th of February of this year. It began in 2014, and between 2014 and the latest invasion, we already had over 14,000 people killed in Ukraine, and 39,000 injured, and over 1 million internal refugees. From the current situation today, the UN is changing constantly. We're looking at 6 million internally displaced, 3 million refugees. Officially, it's 2,500 civilians killed, but we don't actually know that, because the now estimates are Mariupol could be 5,000, probably more. Emergency services don't rescue bodies, they rescue living people. So there's countless number of corpses under buildings that have been hit by shells and missiles. So one estimate, it was a forecast of the UHCR, is you could be looking at possibly up to 50,000 could die in the forecast in this war. It's horrific, an apocalyptic situation unfolding. The Russians, in Komsomolskaya Pravda, reported by mistake an official estimate of over 10,000 Russians killed. It was then removed. According to the Ukrainian army estimate yesterday, they reckon the Russians have lost 17,000 personnel. Even if we half that, that is a huge number in a short period of time that has been lost. And we know now, it's hour by hour, we're seeing a reality of just of terrifying violence being inflicted by this invading army. It is, and it's not, to use that American term, collateral damage. They are deliberately killing civilians, deliberately shelling residential areas. And we know the pattern because we saw it in Syria. And looking at Mariupol now, there's 4,000 Ukrainian troops left. There's 14,000 around them. The danger now is they will take that city and redeploy those 14,000 troops to do the same again on another city. Like Yuliya, I don't trust these negotiations one iota in terms of Putin's plans. They recalibrate in their agenda. In terms of where we are then, I want to start. My position on this is that yes, there is inter-imperial rivalry. There's great power context. I don't see this war as caused by NATO. I don't accept the pretext that this was provoked by some Western expansionism. The last country to join NATO in that territory was the Baltic states 18 years ago. I've never seen 150,000 Russian troops gathering on the Baltic state borders poised to invade. And if that was the reason that, as Putin said, his back was to the wall, he would have taken the Baltic states years ago. There's another arena we need to look at. So Russian imperialism hasn't emerged from nowhere. There's been a deliberate policy of expansionism, of annexation, of aggression, of subterfuge. And it has been escalating since the 1990s, since the Russian economy was in a period of recovery. And this re-emergence of Russia as an imperial power is something that, particularly in the labor movement, it's been neglected, deliberately ignored at times, whitewashed. and an acceptance of old narratives of Russia the victim. And this is an error. We know that the Russian economy, as always is dominated by a small elite. We know that it has monopolies owned by super rich capitalists, oligarchs, which are enmeshed with the Russian state and a military industrial complex. And it's also one of the highest countries for income inequality of its population. Even if you were to take Lenin's analysis of imperialism in 1916, it would apply to Russia today. It is the second largest nuclear power after the US. It's home to the largest arms manufacturing monopoly, second biggest competitor in the world. And it stands alongside China and the USA in terms of military and arms production. They've built up a number of organizations to consolidate their hegemony in the former territory of the Russian Empire. We have the Collective Security Treaty Organization. They built the Eurasian Economic Community. And these are political and military blocs which have been created not as a counterweight to NATO, but to assert Russian imperial dominance again in that territory. They would have been created whether NATO existed or not, is my argument. They flow from the position, the strategic and capitalist interests of Russia itself. Their goal is to restore the hegemony that was lost. Similarly with energy, forms 37% of the Russian budget comes from oil and gas. Yeah? And this is also used as in forms of dominance. They've used coercion, energy as a coercion. We've got 40 major incidents of them cutting off energy in 60 different countries that this has happened. They've used it against Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, Armenia, Turkmenistan, all to use, and Lavrov openly boasts of energy as power against them. Russia has built military bases in Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, and Tajikistan. Most of these countries are nowhere near NATO. That is not the reason for them doing it. And then we have the direct military intervention. We have a direct military intervention and annexations in Transnistria, Chechnya, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and of course, Syria and North Africa to be included. Why is Russia doing this? So I go back to a traditional analysis of the gendarme of European reaction. Russia can't reach into Europe and crush democratic movements anymore, but it can do it in the territory of the former empire, and it has done it. And we only need to look at what happened in Kazakhstan, a country which was in fact close to the West. The intervention there was to crush a popular rebellion, nothing to do with provocations or NATO expansion whatsoever. And that was why, because Russia will not tolerate on its neighbors any form of social or democratic breakthrough, which could threaten its strategic interests and, more importantly, threaten the rule of the elite in the Kremlin. Importantly, could in any manner or form influence or generate opposition within Russia. They will not tolerate happening in a neighboring country a development which would be more democratic or even more socially progressive than what they've created in Russia itself. And that is the answer to the question as to why Russia is invading, annexing, and intervening in countries. And that is why we've had the war on Ukraine. Alongside this, we have to recognize the Ukrainian question in the context of Russian imperialism historically. And it does feed into what Putin has declared. The fact is that without Ukraine, there would have been no Russian empire. The conquest of Ukraine in the 17th century, the seizure of the Crimea, the Black Earth Belt, and the sea is what transformed Muscovy from a Tsardom of Muscovy, a Russian empire. And this isn't a small factor in the mind of Russian nationalism to this day. It is a big factor in the mind of Russian nationalism. and it filters into the racism that permeates the ideology of the Kremlin its war. Ukrainians simply don't exist as a nation, have no legitimacy in the mind of the Kremlin. They're little Russians. And indeed, Petra Kopov published in Novosti a very arrogant manifesto just when Russia began its new invasion, which declared we were restoring the Russian world, we're restoring the little Russians to the Russian world. It'll be the historical fullness of Russia again. And yeah, it wasn't for nothing the Putin buried General Denikin in full military honors in the Kremlin. It isn't for nothing they've restored all this ideology of Tsarism. But of course, just like the Orthodox Church, they're pouring holy water and camouflage to what are actually the interests of rubles, oil, seizure of wealth, and power and influence is the main force here. And what have they come up against? We've heard many arguments about the corruption in the Russian military, about logistical problems, about out-of-date material, which are of course all factors, but the overarching factor for me is that, and we've seen it throughout history, that a people empowered with the idea of freedom have defeated some of the most crack armies in the world. We saw it in the French Revolution, we saw it in Vietnam against the French themselves. And that's what happened to the Russians when they sought to siege Kiev at the beginning of February. They've came up against a popular mobilization that has stunned them to a degree. And they're having to realign and recalibrate their ambition. We don't know yet. Will this be a long-term war of attrition? It may well be. We don't know if they're going to readjust their goals. But they're certainly not achieving what they set out to achieve because of the popular mobilization and resistance of the Ukrainian people. And like Yuliya, I agree. I think in this something quite renewed is happening in terms of fortune, national consciousness and national identity of Ukraine. The total opposite of what the Kremlin wanted to achieve. They really did think they were going to come in here and be given bread and salt and restore their empire. And of course now, as defeat to a degree is imposed on them, they're becoming even more vicious in the waging of the war. I don't estimate there'll be any serious negotiations until they've killed a great many more people in the blackmail through their violence. And where does that leave us? I completely refute any argument that this is 1914 or an inter-imperialist war where we should be opposed to all sides. Even in an inter-imperialist war, there are national questions and colonial questions. This is a war of aggression by an imperial power against a historically oppressed people. But the first thing we need to do is clear our eyes. And one of those things is we need to clear our eyes of all the Ukrainophobia that we've inherited from Tsarism and Stalinism that pollutes the left and its attitude to Ukraine. And by that, I mean the argument that the Ukrainian question is always a creation of foreign powers, not Ukrainians themselves. It was either the Swedes or the Germans, or now it's the Americans or Johnson. But there's not a Ukrainian nation itself that is acting in its own interest. We need to clear our eyes of the bigotry that every expression of Ukrainian national consciousness is fascist or Nazi. Which is the latest of Putin's war to denazify Ukraine by bombing Holocaust memorial sites. We need to remove all this from us. We need to restore an examination of this question with sober senses on it and with truth that, you know, Ukraine is historically oppressed. It's a colonial people resisting recolonization. And in that, abstract calls for peace or not taking sides are futile from a Marxist perspective. We have to take a side, and a clear side, with those who are resisting imperialism in Ukraine. And that means a number of things. First and foremost, we have to defend the right of Ukrainians to obtain arms, as to quote Malcolm X, by all means necessary, in order to defeat Russia. And if we want a revolution in Russia, we want a defeat of the Russians in Ukraine. And for freedom of Ukraine means they have to drive the invaders out. And they're not going to be able to do that without arms. I mean, I find it a little bit ridiculous to be lectured by people saying, well, we should give defensive arms and not offensive arms, but you know, or we shouldn't give arms at all, even though we're against Russia invading. You know, the same people are quite happy to celebrate the Easter Uprising, which was armed by the German Kaiser. I think it's ridiculous hypocrisy on it. You know, it doesn't matter where the guns come from; it's what the people are using them for, in my book. And in terms of arms, you know, you can use a Kalashnikov to defend yourself and also use it on the offensive. It doesn't matter that aspect. Of course, we need arms for people to go on the offensive, and they need arms to stop missiles raining down on cities. They need arms to stop aircraft coming and bombing Mariupol. If we want Ukraine to win, we want all that equipment to be given to them. Similarly, there's the issues of, which is not so controversial, is humanitarian aid to be stepped up. And in terms of the oligarchs, I have no moral hesitation that they should be having their assets and their property sequestrated across the board. It's not happening in this country because we have a government corrupted by Russian oligarchic money. But if we want to talk of refugees, there's the answer. Take their money and take their property, and it should go as compensation to Ukraine. Sanctions are favourable, as we've seen already in Merseyside and Kent, by workers themselves imposing them, and that's what we should be celebrating on it. The refugee issue, I think, is very important, and it goes together with the issue of sanctions on the oligarchs. Equally, I think the issue of transition to a green transition is imperative to wean ourselves off funding a war machine, which is happening. I don't think that's a case of supporting imperialism against Russia. I think it's a case of saving the planet, actually, and stopping imperialist war. And the issue of the debt, that I think is crucial, especially at this moment in time, because it's similar with the arms. I think there's a serious danger that the Western powers are going to twist Zelensky's arm and do the Kremlin's dirty work to get them to accept a dirty deal. Part of that will be that we're not going to send you the arms anymore. And part of us opposing that is we want the arms, and also we want to cancel the debt and rebuild the country. You know, it is blackmail, it is gangsterism. The Western banks are racketing up debts whilst waving a Ukrainian flag, frankly. Those are the concrete things I think we should be doing. As you know, we've got a national demo organised in London. I hope something could happen in Scotland on this. But I'll just conclude on this. I touched on there about clearing our eyes. We have a real crisis of the socialist movement that this war has brought to the fore. It feeds into what our own vision is of a new society. But those who've corrupted themselves, swallowed Stalinist arguments and Russian chauvinist attitudes towards Ukrainians, have polluted the socialist vision to some degree beyond recognition. And we need to also, through our solidarity with the Ukrainian people here, be seeing how we're going to renew our vision of socialism as emancipatory and isn't polluted with Russian nationalism anymore. Yeah.
Is that you, Chris?
For now, brother, I'll go with.
Okay, right. So, any contributions, comrades? I see Alan Boylan's got his hand up. Alan. You have to unmute yourself, Alan. No, can't hear you, comrade. Shall I try and unmute you from here?
I think he's unmuted. I think it's something with the mic input.
It doesn't have the things where you go into reactions and things. How does
Alan, you were talking before, no? Okay, we'll come back to you.
You're not muted just now. You're not, it's down here. You're not muted just now.
Can I go on?
Alan, can you speak? No.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Well, no, it was Alan Boylan. But no,
Okay,
Alan,
right.
no, Alan, you come in, yeah, please.
Yeah,
Alan,
well, first of all, I'd like to thank both Yuliya and Chris for those, extremely sound presentations and very informative presentations. As well, I mean, I think as we're looking up here for the possibilities of the sort of action that we might organise in Scotland. We are behind what's happening in England. I know you had a demonstration at the last weekend. So far there has been no national demonstration in Scotland. Yet certainly I've heard talk about having demonstrations against the banks. Now those banks, the City of London very rightly gets targeted, but the City of London has an outrider, and it's called Edinburgh. The Royal Bank of Scotland and the Bank of Scotland, there will be millions and billions of pounds that have come from oligarchs. It's not properties up here, it's the money that's hidden up here. So certainly, we have a target here and like to get people organised to there. So as soon as you have a date down in London, we'd like to try and organise something on that. A couple of other points is that I was a member of an organisation called the RCN, which was affiliated to RIC Mark I. Now we are no longer in existence in that form, but we do have some money. In fact, we have said we have got £200, which we would like to donate via Scottish RIC. Scottish RIC has its next national forum next Wednesday. So we'll, if Scottish RIC agrees, you'll get £200 via Scottish RIC. I can't see that it won't disagree, but you'll get that £200 anyway. So we've got that donation coming. The other thing, obviously, is we're speaking from the Radical Independence Campaign, and our own campaign for independence. I mean, we're just not looking at anything that's even remotely in the same league or up against anything like the same problems. And to make a comparison in one sense is because, but in a sense, one argument we could be having in this country, and all of those that champion how good the UK is as a democracy, well, show it by saying you could concede a referendum, a peaceable referendum. That would be a major indication that there is, that there is some difference. I don't see that that's going to happen. In many ways, the Johnson government, its idea of what's wrong with its reaction to what's happening in Ukraine will be, we have got to be more like Russia. We've got to arm more. We've got to be more repressive. We've just got to look at all the legislation that's going around at the moment, clamping down on workers' rights, on civil rights, and things like that. Basically, Johnson, in some ways, come from the same right populist mode as Putin. Things haven't got that anything like as far as that in this country, but that is where he would like to take it. So just as you and Chris said, don't expect anything from Johnson or from the West. In Scotland, I think we realise that even more. So once again, I'd like to thank both of you for speaking and contributing. Certainly learned a lot. Thank you.
Any other contributions, comrades? Nick, Steph, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'd just first of all like to echo Alan's point there. I just thank you both very much for your contributions. It was really informative and interesting, kind of giving that background information. And that I've got a kind of, it was a question more about the kind of the politics of the current Ukrainian leadership in terms of on the kind of news programs, they wheel out various people like obviously previous presidents, Petrochenko and various people and it was just, if you could give us briefly a bit of background in terms of what the different politics are of the different kind of bourgeois politicians within the Ukrainian leadership and what the pulls and differences are there.
Okay,
Shall we answer, or do you want to collect a few more points, or how do you want to do it?
I think answering that question actually would help the framework, of our understanding to, perhaps frame other questions. So if you, Yuliya, or Chris would like to come in and respond to that, I think that would be helpful.
I'm happy to start, and Chris, by all means, please do add, because you always have very interesting insights as well, and we'll add something for sure of importance. So yeah, so we had this, in 2013, around these kind of Euromaidans, and then with Yanukovych fleeing and the rest of it, we had, well, you're familiar with Poroshenko and his kind of military obsession. And the thing is, like, it's not so much that he was so kind of militaristically obsessed or like such a patriot or a nationalist or anything of the kind. The thing is, like, for us to understand what his politics were built about, we need to understand how he became president in the first place. So when Yanukovych fled and Russians started moving into the Crimea, Ukraine had an interim president, right? So constitutionally, that person can perform a lot of administrative functions, but they can't be a commander in charge. Mm-hmm. So an interim president can't declare a war, they can't send troops anywhere. And like partly why I remember they said there was this whole kind of announcement of the anti-terrorist operation before there was anything else, had something to do with that. And then it had something to do with the fact that when you're in a proper state of war, some of the relationships with the suppliers of arms and suppliers of credit they change, right? So there was a need to kind of be careful about certain wordings. But like back to Poroshenko. So the reason he managed to become president was because there was already an invasion, and a lot of his political campaign was built around we need a president in the first round of elections, because there is already a military campaign going on. There is already all of these clashes going on in the east and in the south. Crimea is already annexed. So we don't have time for a lengthy electoral campaign. We need a commander in charge. So we need somebody who has an experience, who has connections, blah, blah, all of that and the other. Because if we remember, kind of go back to these Maidan, anti-Maidan protests, well, specifically the Maidan protests, Euromaidan protests, all the oligarchs were booed on stage when they were trying to kind of negotiate with Yanukovych and negotiate with the crowd who were angry with Yanukovych's regime. Nobody wanted them anymore. People were really pissed off, pardon my French, right? So it was clear, like, if there wasn't this contingency of Russian invasion and the whole kind of Donbass and Novorossiya situation, then Poroshenko and some of the other oligarchs wouldn't have managed to stay in power. And there was a lot of narrative politically in the country ever since about certain topics being not just ready yet to be addressed. So there's this word being used, nenachasi. It's not the time. So it's not the time to deal with the oligarchs. It's not the time to kick everybody out of the parliament, because we can't further destabilize the country. And a lot of the volunteers who went straight from this central squares of different cities, because those protests were not just in Kiev, they were in different cities, including Kharkiv and Donetsk and Lugansk. They were everywhere, in to different extent, like, those Euromaidan kind of anti-Yanukovych demonstrations. But a lot of people who joined the volunteer battalions, and they were the ones who were doing all the fighting pretty much in 2014 and 15. They were as angry with oligarchs who stayed in Kiev as they were angry with who they were fighting. And as soon as that fighting was over, they were very clear about it, that they wanted to get rid of the corrupt politicians in Kiev. And so there was this kind of weird situation where kind of one of the parties that was interested in prolonging this kind of war conflict, anti-terrorist operation as long as possible, were people who managed to grab onto their seats in Kiev still. Because that kind of allowed them an excuse for why the economic situation in the country isn't getting better. It allowed them to continue looting and embezzling the state assets, and including IMF loans and EU assistance funds not least the greening funds. There are lots of, cases of embezzlement and all sorts of stuff. So those kind of, the corruption and lawlessness continued after 2014-15. And we saw the rejection, the oligarchic regime that didn't get displaced with these Maidan protests in 2014, that rebellion continued in the voting booths in 2019 when Zelensky was elected president. 40% of people who were going to vote in the second round for Zelensky were voting against Poroshenko. That's the polls, that's what the polls showed. Over 40% voted for Zelensky. Again, that was a protest against Poroshenko. So we had the election of Zelensky was a clear crisis of representation in the country, right? And a rejection of the corrupt regime. And what Zelensky was like, some were saying that he was a bit of a, kind of a puppet of Kolomoisky, that he was kind of planted there. I don't think he necessarily was planted, but he was definitely a useful idiot, right? So he was used and manipulated because at the end of the day, he continued and I think some people in his team really thought they were going to change something. Whether they were too self-confident, or whether they were naive, or whether they were really good at lying, I don't know. I'm not inside their heads, but they really thought that they were going to do things differently. But the problem is that they were pushing neoliberal stuff on the country. So it was a continuation of what was put in place. It was politics that were favoring already established capitalist interests. It was politics that was favoring further crippling of the economy by conditionality of IMF. It was politics that furthered, expropriatory approach that is pushed through the deep comprehensive free trade agreement. The privatization of agricultural land that is written in the constitution that it is the property of the people and it's not for sale. It is it's an anti-constitutional reforms that were demanded as part of the kind of joint effort of EU and the IMF from Ukraine. So because they think that market is king and the history has ended, they are kind of the worst people to have in charge. Because for their lack of economic understanding of what is going on, they're actually continuing whatever plunderous schemes were already in place and making things worse. They do not know how to protect the economy and how to make it grow and make it stable. Even if they have good intentions, and like for their intentions, I can't promise you what their intentions are. And they have benefited themselves. A lot of people in his team, they benefited themselves from these neoliberal reforms. Zelensky is a wealthy man. He was wealthy before he joined. Like, you can't call him an oligarch, but he's quite well to do. Like, he's built a successful business. And like he's, and that kind of idiotic approach that, we have a socioeconomic and cost of living crisis. So yeah, let's digitize pensions and give our grannies smartphones. Like, that's not why they can't pay their gas bills. It's because gas is now traded on global market prices level. And on top of that, oligarchs who are trading it domestically are skimming profit. But you need to have some basic economic understanding, right, of how things work to figure that one out. So that's the kind of the whatever kind of insane phantasmagoria that Ukrainian economy is. And like now, because Zelensky from losing his ratings in the last couple of years progressively, now he's a national hero, and chances are that he will remain president once there is the victory. And we've already seen that his government has put in some horrendous reforms. So they've banned a bunch of parties that they deem pro-Russian, and some of them have some this kind of continuation of decommunization stuff. So some have kind of left-wing names. They're not quite left-wing in politics, but still it's something for us to watch and be worried about. Next, there was a complete borderline destruction of the labor code for the wartime effort. So a lot of companies are allowed to pay borderline no tax. They're allowed to hire, fire, and make people work whatever crazy hours. And whether that will, because there were attempts to destroy whatever labor code and protections are still in place previously, and not all of it was successful. So we'll have to see whether this kind of this marketeering obsession that like even Reagan didn't dream about will stay in place or not. So he's going to be a very useful idiot to stay in place for Western capital and for local oligarchs to continue exploit. And then small and medium enterprises are already suffering from that kind of thing. Actually, one of the meetings that I had with the Confederation of Trade Unions, like there was a representative of small and medium enterprise union there. They work with the Confederation of Other Trade Unions in Ukraine because they're kind of, they're your cartels. They're what's called sole traders. They're like, one man, like self-employed people or enterprises with like small enterprises of a few people who are just, they're not taken care of otherwise. So they're taking their matters in their own hands. And the administrative pressure and the tax pressure and all sorts of this kind of, let's make it look very European reforms, like, you're a sole trader and you have, you're going to self-employed person and you have to have a special kind of documentation, you have to hire a special accountant, you have to have special kind of machinery to get all of your accounts in order. All of that stuff, if you don't have very much, if you don't make much to begin with, can kind of makes you shut down altogether. So all of these kind of let's make it look European reforms are not fit very often for the realities of how the economy works in Ukraine. And so what I fear may happen again is like further concentration of capital and monopolization, oligopolization of a lot of sectors, and a further exacerbation of socioeconomic inequalities that exist in the country. I'm going to stop at that because I think I've already kind of went on a whole rant.
Okay, thank you, Yuliya. Again, full of facts that a lot of us wouldn't be aware of, and an analysis that we're only just really getting our heads around. So it's really good to hear you give your opinion forcefully like that. Chris, did you want to come in on that?
I was just thinking back when Zelensky got elected, when left were very starry-eyed about Zelensky. That this was a negation of the nationalism of Poroshenko and the war, etc. And it's true, he did get a very big peace dividend, but and I know Yuliya wrote a very fantastic article at the time on the I think what it was titled the recalibration of the oligarchic elite, which provoked some shock by some people, but it was the absolute truth because this is what was happening. So that I think if it was a comparison with Zelensky's party, it would maybe something maybe similar to the French situation, that kind of populist party, and it has got this stark contradiction between this gloss of European Union liberal democracy, a great many young careerist liberals who genuinely probably do believe they're going to create this. And then there's a stark reality of the neoliberal politics and an oligarchic elite who still run everything. That they have, they don't reconcile. And then there was the war. Zelensky won on this landslide of a certain peace dividend, and then began these negotiations, I thought almost naively, and immediately Putin just told him to F off because he immediately began issuing Russian passports in Donbass and kicked it out the water. And at that point, I would tend to have thought something's on the horizon. You look back on it, and they should have been preparing to a degree for it. And then he didn't continue any negation of the type of narrow nationalism of Poroshenko. They continued it, and this is where some of those those who welcomed them completely misjudged this nationalism that was created under Poroshenko or developed under Poroshenko is conservative nationalism, is precisely to legitimize a conservative oligarchic system. That's why they glorify Bandera and Petlura and Skoropadsky.
And appease some of the battalions who wanted to kill them.
Not because of the history. It's because of the money and the bourgeoisie, on it. So I think that is a crux. I agree. There's a stark contradiction between the liberal desires of certain of the middle class and the stark reality of the oligarchic system, and no one feels it more than the Ukrainian working class. And this is very dangerous. I agree. What's happening just now, because in one sense, it doesn't make a huge difference in the conditions of a war. People are working round the clock almost voluntarily to resist the Russians. But as soon as it ends, they've been wanting to abolish labour rights since before the war, and now they've got it done. They can continue after the war with a form of what they've already brought in. And of course, who is funding them to abolish the labour laws? The Tory government, providing the advisors on it. So it's, I'm a little bit, I mean, I don't know what you think, Yuliya. I'm a little bit optimistic in a sense that there's been so much solidarity in the course of this struggle that there is that possibility that that cooperation, that solidarity in society can create the potential for a renewed struggle at the end of the conflict. That more, and of course all the oligarchs have already left the country before the first Russian bombs fell on Kiev. They flew to Switzerland in private jets, and everyone has seen them. You know what they did. So I mean, I hope that potential is there through the struggle to defeat the Russians, that it can continue in some form to reshape the country after the war.
I think some of it is there, but like, you know, some of these oligarchs, I'll just add one sentence because I see there is a question, but I think it's an important thing that I kind of forgot to mention. Like, so some of them have fled now, and some of them are sort of like, they're not announcing where they are, but we know they're abroad. Why would they be here? Like Akhmetov, for example, you know, and like Kolomoisky, they're kind of, you know, they're trying to be this kind of like mecenates. So they're trying to be sponsors of this. So like, you know, they're throwing a bit of cash at the volunteers and a bit of cash on territorial defense. And you're like, should have paid your taxes, mate, you know, like, you know, thanks for this. But, you know, and at the end of the day, there is always, you know, it's strategic philanthropy. They're not doing this out of goodwill. They're trying to kind of, they're protecting their own because a lot of their enterprises are here, right? So they want to be on okay terms with whoever will remain in power. So there is that. There are also some, and this is what I kind of forgot to mention, who have fled already in 2014-15, like after Yanukovych, when like his political party has dissolved. And we have seen like, you know, a bit of a class solidarity internationally where some of their assets were frozen, and then there was long litigation because obviously they have created this horrendous situation in the country. And then those assets were unfrozen, like including Yanukovych himself. Right, so like, you know, he's barely suffered any financial losses, and there was an attempt actually to bring him back and install him as a kind of as a new president after killing Zelensky. Like they brought him to Belarus. The Russian troops brought him to Belarus, and there were some news reports that he's ready to come back and kind of reestablish the justice of the last 8 years. And it was a running joke in Ukraine because everybody was like, we expelled him by the whole country got rid of him. Like you couldn't find anyone more suitable. This is ridiculous. And yeah, it's just, yeah, but it also kind of shows you kind of how ridiculous this whole campaign is. It's like, okay, you wanted to take over the country, clearly, like, you know, there are examples, like, you know, there is evidence of that. Some of the first machinery and tanks that were coming in, like, you know, the military who were coming in, they had their kind of their parade uniform with them, that, you know, their kind of holiday uniform with them, so that they would kind of have a celebration parade because they thought they were going to take over Kiev. Like, we have grannies take out drones with jars of pickled tomatoes and tractors pulling away tanks. Good luck. You know, this is just like, you can't, even if you try to take over, you can never hold on to this land. You haven't learned in these hundreds of years still. I mean, you know, some sense of reality at least. Like, you know, this is kind of people who are completely delusional for some unknown reason. Yeah, so that's the kind of the thing I suppose I wanted to add. Like, you know, it will be interesting, like, you know, with these oligarchs, what's going to happen really. But I don't know how much throwing of cash at what's going on is going to help them really, and I think this is a historical opportunity to take over what they have been stealing for the last 30 years.
Thank you, Yuliya. Could I bring George in and then Alan Boylan?
Yeah, Thanks, Yuliya, and thanks, Chris. I mean, I pretty much concur wholeheartedly with pretty much everything that you've said. So either that makes me a genius or it makes, you know, whatever, but, you know, hopefully great minds think alike on that. I mean, it really is the worst of times at the moment. It really is. Women, the children, it's hard to watch, you know, it's just emotionally very hard to deal with. And, you know, my heart goes out to what is happening. And what I kind of thought was interesting is Yuliya's point about the market as king, you know, like how that neoliberalism, it renders us all, you know, in a poor situation. And, you know, it feels very much like meet the new boss, you know, same as the old boss. I mean, I don't want to, I mean, everyone's in the last few weeks have become pop-up experts on Ukraine. I probably know more about Shakhtar Donetsk and the Vikings in the 10th century than I know about the current Ukraine situation. So, I mean, just this is maybe, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but Chris, I heard, and a guy I know from the internet and stuff like this, just a question, quick question for Chris. I just overheard that you're getting some bad press in terms of certain, shall we call them left-wing circles? Could just maybe, you know, maybe just give me some ideas why that is. And again, maybe just one more point to make. So if I'm rambling here, is I think it's also important that we in Scotland try and use, we don't just know about Ukraine, but we try and use our sphere of influence, you know, to do some practical things, some practical politics. You know, so a question for Yuliya and Christopher is, you know, what can people in Scotland do in a meaningful way that is supportive of Ukrainian people, which is clearly a nation, and everything else is just utter nonsense. So, you know, maybe that's a bit of a ramble, but hopefully those two questions, you could maybe deal with those. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, George. I'd like Alan to come in, and then I wouldn't mind having a quick tuppence worth as well. Can you come in, Alan Boylan? We can't hear you, Alan. All right, okay. Maybe we'll get you back. I just wanted to say a couple of things, and then give Yuliya and Chris the opportunity to answer with whichever bits they feel comfortable about answering, by the way. One thing I found really useful was the conflict put in the historical context of the relationship between the old Russian Empire and Ukraine, and seen it as a resurgence of Russian imperialism, and the examples that you used of other countries where these things are going on and are much less related to NATO. I think one of the problems certainly for the UK left is that we don't want to be seen to be soft on NATO, right? And I think that's right. We should retain our critique of NATO. You know, it's the armed forces of the enemy, as far as I'm concerned. But we've got this critique of Russian imperialism as well, which I think gives us the kind of framework of an independent class analysis, which I think is very, very helpful, right? I think one of the tasks for us is, you know, we need to offer and deliver solidarity to people struggling in Ukraine against the Russian invasion. One of the difficulties is how do we do that without appearing to support bourgeois forces, right? And I'm not saying I've got an answer to this, because because in a way we've got exactly the same problem here. Obviously, to a lesser extent, nobody's bombing us, right? But how do we as socialists work with non-socialist forces in a liberatory manner, in a manner of resistance that paves the way. So we need to make alliances, principled alliances, so that we can free ourselves from the United Kingdom, and then posing that as a step toward in the direction of socialism, for which we get attacked all the time by papers who recently attacked Chris as being nationalists, right? You know, as opposed to internationalists. So there's lessons here for us. You know, we have the challenge of delivering actual solidarity to the comrades in Ukraine, but also learn the lessons for ourselves. How do we operate? And I think we've been trying to do that. I think we're making progress, but maybe we need to theorize that. But I know Alan Armstrong's been writing stuff about that very, very recently. It gives some pointers on that. Anyway, anybody else want to come in before we have our speak? George, your hand is still up. Yeah, okay. Okay, well, can I bring in Yuliya and Chris to respond to that quite broad-reaching series of questions from us?
Well, you asked me a very direct question. Why am I getting a lot of stick? I don't know how to. I didn't quite know how to answer it. Whether it's just my charming nature or my politics, maybe it's both. I think of them as people who have any actual, I think, story or experience. Most people are more contemporary. I'm more interested in history, I would say, than fact. But and we did regroup, being Solidarity Campaign going through this period. But I suppose up until that, we might have been a thorn in the side of some people, but not significant as now. And I think at the present time, what has happened is it has been more significant, because those people who were accommodationists to Putin and to Russian imperialism are in deep trouble. Run up to the war, to the current invasion, I think they seriously discredited themselves. Some of the statements which were being made from Stop the War, for example, were simply deranged about the things they were saying. Were just mad about skepticism that the Russian troops are really there. I heard Diane Abbott say that. We had a constant downplaying of the Russian threat, that they actually were going to invade, and repetitions of Putin's pretexts and excuses coming from people who were meant to be on the left. And then, of course, Russia did invade, and now they're in a problem. Now they're trying to cover their backside and claim they're actually for the Russians to leave, etc., and think we all have amnesia. But simultaneously, I think the majority of the working class, the majority of trade unionists and the labour movement actually do stand by Ukraine. And so those of us who have been articulating a position from knowledge of the situation are now coming in for attack. And we were coming in for attack during Maidan, we were coming in for attack before, but and now we're coming in attack from different quarters, from the Stalinists and their converts, and then from the some of the other Stop the War types on the left. So, I mean, I'm not as worried about the harebrained accusations in comics that have been published recently. The other attack on me, where I was expelled from the editorial board of an academic journal, was a bit more serious, actually, because it was very specific that I was expelled because of my criticism of the Stop the War campaign, because I'd said there were Putin fans in its leadership, which is a provable fact. You know, there's a book here, not to be confused with Yuliya's book by Andrew Murray, also called The Empire in Ukraine. Yeah. Now, it is full of quotes of Vladimir Putin and favourable quotes by what was the national chair and spokesperson of Stop the War. And there's a fact that these people up until now have been defending this tyrant. And what I've said is true, but the attacks on me are because of the positions that have been taken, and they want to discredit our campaign. They want to discredit influence we got, which we've got. We have got some influence now in quarters. We wouldn't have got this coalition of unions if we didn't, if our ideas didn't correlate. Yeah, they also want to discredit us among the left. So I mean, it's a deliberate agenda, in my view, from people who substitute smears and subterfuge, quite common to the Kremlin actually, for political debate. Yeah, and that's what they're doing. So you know, from my perspective, I'm not folding. I've had a position on Ukraine for many years. I've hardened my position even more, and you know, I want to see Russia suffer a bloody defeat in Ukraine. I want to see Ukraine free, and I'm not going to compromise on those positions whatsoever, no matter how much they're going to throw at me now. So I've been called a Banderite by the left. I've been, you know, and now I'm, you know, a CIA agent and a Nazi by the others. I mean, it's just, you know, what can you say? It's, you know, classic and but not unusual at all. Not unusual at all. People who have defended Ukraine in Ukraine, Ukrainians who have stood up for decades have had to be subject to those types of smears constantly. Some of them get sent to prison under the accusation of being Banderite bourgeois nationalists. So what's been thrown at me is quite small mercy compared to what other people have had to suffer, frankly, you know.
Thank you, Chris. Yuliya, did you?
Yeah, I guess it's a shorter one from me. I second what Chris has said. It's a bit, as Germans say, ein bisschen komisch, bit funny, like, you know, when you have you know, people who have been defending Putin all of a sudden kind of going, well, but you know, maybe he's wrong, but he was provoked by NATO. And you're like, okay, like how many and how much deeper holes are you willing to dig yourself into before you can just say, maybe we've gotten this one wrong? I mean, like how difficult is it to accept that, you know, sometimes, you know, like we're all humans, we misjudge situations, sometimes because we're blinded or biased, sometimes because we didn't do enough work, sometimes because we simply do not want, we want to see something else where something quite different is. And, you know, I think before, like until there is a bit of growing up happening among some left groups, it's going to be permanently difficult to build meaningful coalitions. And like, you know, and we get these criticisms of being sectarian and infighting and whatnot. Well, kind of which political movement isn't, right? But at the same time, you know, we need to be like, we do like to think that the left does have more grown-up politics and a more realistic and a kind of our-centering human beings and natural and environmental survival over kind of some idiotic equations adding up. So why can't we accept that sometimes some of us are also human and can make mistakes? Like, you know, how much collective, how big a collective fund should we raise for people to get some therapy and kind of get over their egos a little bit, you know? Yeah, and the Stop the War coalition has been a source of frustration, seriously. And like in the latest iterations, like, you know, you hear like people like Tariq Ali speaking on those panels and like talking about how essential partition of Ukraine could be a kind of a lesser evil in the current situation because it will preserve civilian lives. And you go, have you read what happened in 2014 and 15? I'm not even talking previous centuries of Ukrainian history. But like the last 8 years, like, do you know what's going on in those so-called people's republics of Lugansk and Donetsk or the Crimea? Do you know the plight of the Crimean Tatar people? Do you know about forced labor camps in those so-called people's republics, torture and kidnappings, destruction of industry and the mining sector? Like, it's all the doing, like, you know, dismantling of enterprises and moving of them to Rostov Oblast by Russia. Like, what do you think will happen to people who will stay in those forfeited territories? And also, how many Ukrainians exactly are we supposed to throw into the Putin's mouth to appease him in this yet another bite at Ukrainian territory? And how long do we need to wait till the next one comes? Like, how can somebody of that level and that with that amount of experience and that amount of reading behind them arrive at such a conclusion? This is what I cannot understand. You know, when somebody is making those judgments and statements because they're simply they don't have enough information, they don't have enough experience, they don't know enough history, you know, it's forgivable to some extent. But when people like Tariq Ali are saying that, you're going, seriously? Like, like, you know how these things work. You don't have any excuses. And so, yeah, like it's really frustrating. So that's kind of my beef with it. Like those stop the war panels, they never have any Ukrainians on them. They started pulling out, like I think they got some criticism about not having. Last one I saw advertised that they had all the kind of Anglo-Saxon, a couple not quite Anglo-Saxon names, all male, and then Ukrainian speakers, some anonymous Ukrainian speakers that they were hoping, I suppose, that was the ad. Yeah, the kind of the flyer. They were hoping to kind of pull out of the hat last minute, I suppose, because that's kind of how strong is the dialogue with Ukrainian scholars is of the whole platform, or even activists or anybody, you know. So that's kind of quite frustrating. In terms of kind of building solidarities and helping, I understand your frustration and I know your political position around Scotland, and indeed, you know, the plight of Scottish people and then the fight of Scottish people is something that is also quite old and quite painful, and I understand that there are certain that your current situation puts certain limitations on what you can do internationally, especially in terms of supporting Ukraine. But there is a lot that can be done, like, you know, joining us in demonstrations, writing collective letters, writing petitions, organizing panels like this, amplifying certain messages. That, you know, that is something that can be done. And that is something that also I think there is also a message of hope in what Ukrainians are doing right now to those Scots who still haven't forfeited their hope of becoming true masters of their destiny and their land. That it is possible, you know, and for the Scottish people, I don't think it has to come at the price that it's coming for Ukrainian. So if Ukrainians are doing what they're doing in trying to get autonomy over their destiny, I think Scotland can have that too. And I really hope to live to see Scotland truly sovereign and independent. Scotland is beautiful and full of amazing people, and it would be amazing to see it sovereign and free. And yeah, and I hope to dance on your Independence Day with a glass of nice whiskey. Yeah, but go on demos, share our campaigns, and we'll support you in yours always. Because our hearts will my heart is in the steppes and your heart is in the highlands, but there with the workers of the world, and we should stand with each other in these difficult campaigns. And, you know, building international solidarity, I think, you know, it's one of the things that we can amplify, and we should amplify in these campaigns, because, like, you know, you say, like, you know, you get labeled, like, you know, Scottish independence movement sometimes get labeled as, oh, these kind of crazy nationalists, or Ukrainians, or the crazy nationalists. The thing is that English nationalist movement and German nationalist movement and Russian nationalist movement are not quite the same as the Irish nationalist movement or the Scottish nationalist movement or the Welsh or the Ukrainian. You know, and I have made those selections of countries and nations deliberately because of who is in the room here, you know, because there is Britain and there is Russia, and their colonial histories have similarities. And, you know, and I think this is something that is missing a lot from from the Stop the War and like other tankies. And I'm not saying that everybody in Stop the War is a tankie, but tankies are saying a lot of what Stop the War are now saying is that all nationalism somehow is wrong. It's like, well, internationalism can only be once all nations are free, not before. Like, you cannot build an internationalist movement when there are still empires on maps. You know, so you need to emancipate every nation who is striving for self-determination, and then you build international solidarity. And yes, those processes need to be built towards in parallel, but you can't be kind of, you know, you can't be blaming countries who are still in some sort of semi-colonial relationship with their old metropole for wanting to be autonomous. You know, there is nationalism that is decolonial, and there is nationalism that is trying to assimilate other nations and countries into its own, like what Russia's doing now, right? Or what the English have been doing with different degrees of success internationally. So I think that the understanding of that needs to be present. And without that, you know, and it's, I think there is also, you know, there is this kind of critique. I was like, this week I was supposed to be talking about this at the International Studies Association conference, but I'm in Vinica, so I'm not. But I'm doing something more interesting here, like despite the horrendous circumstances, is that like there is a lot of problems in decolonial, post-colonial scholarship of the West that only sees it like it's a hall of mirrors that is kind of with its own color scheme, that only sees kind of the white people oppressing the non-white people of Africa and Latin America. And somehow all other colonialism and imperialisms are kind of, they're not quite there. And so you have this kind of Eurocentrism being reflected even in post-colonial, decolonial scholarship. It's not recognizing that there were a lot of different empires and colonialisms, and you know, and it wasn't always that white people colonized people of darker skin. There are different forms of otherings and different qualities that are being used to oppress some people by the other. And it's not a competition of which colonialism was worse. You know, it's a recognition that you have to recognize that, yes, there are like, you know, fewer people of African descent in Ukraine, and that is kind of being thrown at Ukrainians sometimes by some Western scholars, like, oh, it's so white. Yeah, we never colonized Africa, so maybe that's why. We actually were colonized by Ottomans and Mongols and Russians. So, yeah, but you know, a lot of that get lost, and of course, you know, like how England behaved to its neighbors is also something that gets lost in that narrative. And you know, and there needs to be space, you know, for solidarity between different countries and nations who had their cultures and their land colonized. Like we should be able to kind of see past that. And like some of these angry narratives about white fragility and, you know, everybody who's white is somehow the oppressor is also not always helping. Like, I'm not trying to diminish the suffering of people of color by in any way. But there is more to this narrative than that, and there is, and you know, and one thing that is heavily missing is the class analysis, because at the end of the day, there is global capital in collective interest as a class, and it's more consolidated now than it's ever been in the history of humanity because of transnationalization of money making and profit making rather. Than ever before. And there is global labor that is being pitched against each other. And sometimes identity politics allows us something progressive, but very often it's becoming a handmaiden, and then it gets manipulated to pitch different groups of people against each other. And it's really tragic to see, because we should be able to single out specific characteristic against which people are othered, but at the same time have a very comprehensive intersectional analysis of how all of those interplay, and not allow those kind of become dividing lines between workers internationally. So I think, let's dance to Scottish independence and the Irish and the Welsh. That would be a great day. At least the royals were met very well on their tour, so there is a hope in there.
Yeah. Thank
Have
you,
you seen
Yuliya.
the images? Have you seen the images from the Will and Kate's tour of the Commonwealth? Oh my God! It's speaking of out of touch. You're talking of Putin. I mean, yeah. I think I'll stop at that because I
we have
can go
our
to.
homegrown versions. Okay, folks. Any further questions, comments, observations? Okay.
Fine,
I think
thank you.
Chris wants to sing Scottish anthem.
No, no. I've already been denounced for. It's funny enough you mentioned that because the same paper that you referred to earlier said that my support for Ukraine was because of my Scottish nationalism, and John McDonnell's support for Ukraine was because of his years of support for the Irish struggle. So,
Well,
Just
and that's no. I'm trying to understand how that's offensive.
for me, it wasn't, because there actually is a degree of, you know, because.
Was that the Weekly Worker by any chance?
Oh yeah, you don't need to name those idiots. But the reality is, if you do have some understanding of Scottish national question and the Irish national question, you will begin to have sympathy and comprehension of Ukrainian history.
Yeah, so basically you were criticized for having empathy and solidarity with other suffering nations.
Yeah. Some people might call it being human. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, do you see that's a flaw? That's a flaw in a true fighter for the world revolution.
Yeah, thank you. So, Slava Ukraini.
All right. Okay, folks.
It was so great to speak with all of you. Thank you for having us here.
Well, thank you. You have
Thank you.
contributed enormously to our understanding, you and Chris. Thank you very much. So, Will, is it the mood of the meeting that we end here? Because at some point I've got to press stop recording.
Yes.
Yes. Can we, that's very,
What?
thanks, Yuliya and Chris. That was great.
Yes, it was
Thanks,
fantastic.
Alan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mira.
Yeah.